Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
I believe this agreement will be seen as a pivotal moment in Europe's journey.
Europe as a whole has now a big chance to come out stronger from the crisis. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but tonight is a big step forward towards recovery.
After one of the longest summits in EU history, Charles Michel, President of the European Council, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a €750 billion package this week to fund Europe's recovery from COVID-19. It came as part of a 7-year budget worth €1.8 trillion. Crucially, the money includes both loans and grants to struggling member states. And it marks a new step in sharing the financial burden, with countries agreeing to issue bonds together to fund the relief efforts. But behind the display of solidarity and cohesion were long and difficult negotiations that exposed the bloc's deep fault lines. I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm joined by Bert Colijn, ING's Senior Eurozone Economist, to find out more about the agreement, what it means for future integration, and its implications for the economy and markets. But first of all, tell us how significant you think this agreement really is. There were a lot of compromises made along the way. Was this a good result?
It is a very significant agreement that's been made here. We can definitely call it a historical deal that EU leaders have finally come to after a marathon 5 days of negotiations. A lot of compromises were made along the way, indeed, but I think that's always the case when EU leaders come together, especially when it's about such hotly debated issues like giving grants to certain countries, like borrowing from the capital markets as the EU itself. And the fact that that is what the EU has ultimately landed on here means that this is a historical deal in terms of solidarity. It didn't really look like there was a lot of unity at the table as negotiations happened. So obviously there were quite some political problems along the way to get there. But as that's usually what's happened, I think we can definitely call the deal historic, and the political turmoil that it caused between leaders is something that will, at least for now, be forgotten. And the question is if that is lasting or not.
Well, as you say, EU leaders agreed to issue common bonds to fund the recovery efforts. This is obviously to provide relief from the specific economic impact of the coronavirus, but it also sets a precedent of sorts, doesn't it? Is this Europe's Hamilton moment, as the German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz said? Is it the first step towards a fiscal union?
That's very, very difficult to tell whether that will actually be the case. That will require a crystal ball, and we don't have that. Surely it's cracked the door towards more fiscal integration. And the question very much is whether we can actually see more steps of integration along these lines of sort of a more permanent borrowing in the capital markets at some point in next crisis. Because, even though we've made this step towards more integration here, we've also seen that it's not like the trust between countries all of a sudden has improved markedly. You still see that there are a lot of reservations that have been made by countries in these negotiations that wanted safety nets to be there for how conditionality on how the money is going to be used, which are all signs, of course, that countries are not ready to move into a full fiscal union at this point at all. But as I said, the door's been opened a little bit, and we'll really have to see what happens in the next crisis, whether indeed we're then going to see the same method pursued again with more borrowing in the capital markets. And that could be sort of the next step along the way towards more of a fiscal union. But we're very much not there yet, and it's not a guarantee that at the next crisis, a similar path will be undertaken.
But is the money from the recovery fund going to countries that have had the most severe lockdown and therefore the biggest hit economically? In other words, is it going to the right places?
In essence, we don't really know yet for sure. We do know that the way that they've set up the recovery and resilience funds is in a way that the first 2 years are going to see disbursements on the back of a calculation that the European Commission has already made. So we know which countries are going to get what. That's for the first 2 years, and that's 70% of the total of the grants that will be handed out as part of the RRF, if we're going to use European acronyms, and you have to, because that's what you do if you talk about Brussels. And what we know from there is that it's based essentially on the weakness of the economy in recent years, and of course, how large the population is. And that key will give you a decent distribution, also looking at the vulnerability to this particular corona crisis. So countries like Italy and Spain are going to get more out of it, around 2.5% and 3.5% respectively. Italy 2.5%, is Spain 3.5%. And you see that countries like Netherlands, Germany, and France all get below 1% out of the fund for those first 2 years. Greece gets a lot, even though Greece is not particularly hard hit or as hard hit as Italy and Spain. They will get a larger percent of GDP, of their own GDP, as a disbursement from the fund, which is nevertheless very helpful given the state of the Greek economy structurally. And then for the last year, we see that those last 30% are going to be distributed depending more on how deep the crisis has actually been. And that's only to be determined later, of course. So therefore, they only do that for the third year of disbursement. But there we simply don't know yet which countries are going to get a larger share and which don't, depending on how deep the crisis is. So it looks like, at least for the third year, it will be very dependent on how bad the crisis has been. And for the first 2 years, it's dependent on how strong the economy was moving into the corona crisis. And there we also see that probably the countries that were relatively hard hit are also going to get a somewhat larger share.
But the EU has made the payment of grants conditional on economic reform. Just explain how this will work. Will it actually incentivize countries to reform, or could it be a recipe for some future conflict?
Well, this is where the story gets a bit murky. I mean, this was one of the most hard-fought parts of the negotiations that took a lot of discussions among EU leaders over the past weekend. What we see is they've come to a compromise on this, where I think all leaders were generally favorable to some conditionality around the disbursements of grants. The question is how strict the conditionality was and whether there was a veto that countries could place over other member states' progress. In the original proposal by the European Commission, there was already some form of conditionality included, but some of the more worried member states, if you will, wanted to include a veto of member states on other states' progress. So if the progress on certain reforms were not strong enough, that these countries could veto disbursements of grants. That's not come in, but what has come in is that a country can flag there are no reforms happening or reforms are not happening as quickly as we would like, that it would be raised to European leaders at the Council that would then have to make a quick judgment call on whether grants can ultimately be disbursed or not. It's a difficult system, a typical European compromise on the matter. And ultimately, we will have to see whether that's actually going to be used or not. What countries have to do in terms of conditionality is the following. They have to look at the recommendations that the European Commission makes on a semi-annual basis for countries to improve their economies. That needs to be part of the plans that are going to be submitted for the coming years. And of course, there needs to be a growth and jobs agenda involved, because ultimately this is still about fighting one of the deepest economic crises that the Eurozone has been in. And if they follow up on that, then grants will be disbursed. And if not, then we get into that difficult process that we just described.
Right, but the money won't be distributed until next year, and 30% of it won't even come until 2023, right? So is that soon enough to have a material impact?
Well, it's still going to be helpful because we're definitely not going to be back at levels of output seen prior to the crisis when we enter 2021, and probably also not when we enter 2022, maybe not even when we enter 2023. Ideally, you would like to see this money dispersed as soon as possible, rather last week than at the beginning of next year. But since this process is already so difficult to negotiate and it's part of the EU budget that only starts next year, this is what European leaders were able to land on. That is not ideal, but it's already a significant step, and it will still have significant impact, especially next year. Ideally, you front load it as much as possible. But even when you get to 2023, the 30% that's going to be disbursed by then will probably still be helpful to improve economic output back to levels closer to its potential, given how historically deep this crisis is right now. It's a bit of a race against the clock, but if countries do need the money sooner, then there is actually enough that the EU has already provided, but that will not be in terms of grants, but will be loans through the ESM.
Right. Now, up until this agreement had been struck, the relief efforts had largely fallen on the ECB's shoulders. Does this now take some of the pressure off the central bank a little bit?
It does a little bit. I like to say that the ECB used to be the only game in town in the euro crisis. It was pretty much the only game in town at the beginning of this crisis. But now it seems like player two has entered the game. And that, I think, is quite a relief for the ECB and ECB President Lagarde. Lagarde has been banging the drum about fiscal stimulus to national member states for quite some time already. And now that the EU has come up with its own pillar to support that, that will be a big relief in Frankfurt for sure. It is not likely going to change the ECB's plans in the short run. For sure, we will see continued stimulus from the ECB and continued significant asset purchases to stabilize bond markets in the coming months, especially because the money will not be disbursed until 2021 at least. But for the aftermath of this crisis, it could mean that the ECB has some more room to play and does not need to maintain as much of an expansionary monetary policy in the years as we're recovering, which means that there is some more room for the ECB to change policy somewhat sooner. When that will happen and how quickly that will happen very much has to do with how deep this crisis is actually going to become. And it's only been a few months and we know that it's very deep, but we don't know all that much about the recovery so far. So it will still be very difficult to determine any path out of this for the ECB. But it's likely that it will help them to have somewhat more room to play in the aftermath of this.
Mm-hmm. Now, the EU also agreed on the next 7-year budget, but the UK's departure obviously changes things here. Do you foresee more infighting among the remaining 27 members over this in the years ahead?
Well, in the years ahead, it's difficult to say because, of course, for now, we're in the process of locking in the budget. There's a deal between EU leaders. EU Parliament has to vote on it now. But let's say that this all moves ahead swiftly from here on, then it will be silent on this matter for quite some time. But of course, we do see that there's been a big trade-off that's happened here. The EU has decided to front-load the budget through the recovery fund, but that's come somewhat at a cost of the longer-term budget that has become smaller than what it would have been if the UK had been part of it, obviously. And we see that there are quite some pillars that would be relevant for longer-term growth. Think of innovation, for example, R&D spending, longer-term investment projects that have all taken a cut to be able to make the recovery fund happen. So that means that there are definitely downsides to the result that has been found from an economics perspective, because also in the longer run, the EU economy needs a bit of a boost. As prior to this crisis, everyone was all talking about how the Eurozone or the EU was moving into a Japan-style economic scenario for the years ahead. The corona crisis doesn't change all that much about it, so you would expect that a boost for the longer run would also be important. Given how the UK has left and the negotiations were already very hard fought, it has caused the budget to be smaller than some would have liked it to be. And the question is very much when we get to the next negotiation round later in the decade, to see whether at that point there is going to be a significant increase again, or whether the EU is going to be stuck at a somewhat lower level of spending for quite some time, which would probably be unhelpful for the longer run growth perspectives.
Okay, Bert Colijn, ING Senior Eurozone Economist. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, nor is it investment, legal or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-disclaimer.